All right, folks, it's time to start. If I could have your attention, please. Yeah, thanks for your patience. Hey, how are you all?
I didn't mean to get so far out. I just wanted to talk about brain rot.
All right, folks, it's time to start. If I could have your attention, please. Oh no, I got mic feedback. Just a sec. Hey, how are you all? Yeah, well, I hope this is fine. I guess I'll just not talk for too long. First off, let's see if the audio is fine now for our YouTube viewers. So please let us know in the chat. Thank you. Yeah, well, I hope this is fine. Oh man, yeah, there's some issues, guys. Hold on. First off, I think I fixed them now. So yeah, sorry for that. It's been a while since we've done one of these, so as you can see, I'm clearly a little bit rusty. Let's just pretend none of that happened and get on with it. So today with us we have Nicholas Chappell, also known as Hermeticulture. He's with us today for giving this presentation titled Golden Dawn History, Context, Culture, Collapse and Continuation. So before I do the administrative announcements, a brief introduction about this presentation. So in the late 19th century, we witnessed a remarkable resurgence of interest in the occult, culminating in the establishment of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which some of you may already know a little bit about. This presentation delves into the cultural and historical milieu of Britain at the end of the 19th century, exploring the intellectual currents and societal shifts that contributed to the birth of the Golden Dawn. By examining key influences from contemporary esoteric organizations, literary movements, and the broader occult revival, we gain insight into the formative years of this influential tradition. We'll trace the Golden Dawn's trajectory from its inception through its eventual fragmentation, highlighting the enduring impact on modern esoteric practices and its legacy in contemporary occultism. Join us as we uncover the alchemy of ideas that forged the Golden Dawn and continue to inspire seekers today. So Nicholas Chappell himself has been a student of Western esotericism and the Golden Dawn tradition specifically for more than 20 years. We're very happy to have him with us today. He will introduce himself further, I'm sure, when we get started with the presentation. So yeah, thank you, Nick, for being here. It took us a while to get stuff together. I'm glad we got it done. Yeah, thank you so much for having taken the time and the effort to set this up. And yeah, I hope you'll enjoy it too. Yeah, some emojis, some applause, whatever works for you guys. Give the guy a warm welcome or some yelling, whatever, it's fine. Yeah, so the administrative things, right? Just a second so I don't miss any. I'd like to ask you to keep your microphones fully muted the entire time, except for breaks and the Q&A sections. There might be one, there might be multiple. So yeah, just be aware what your mic is doing at any given time. There is no assistant moderator today. That means I won't have as much space to give warnings when this goes wrong, so please make sure you get it right. I would hate to have to kick some people of it, to resolve the issues. Also for volume settings, make sure you have avatar volumes set all the way to 0. That way, when somebody joins with a loud avatar, you won't notice and you won't be disturbed by it. For voice settings, turn up Nick's voice if you'd like to. or turn the volumes however you like them to be. If you want to, you can also clear up your UI's elements like name tags, group icons, and stuff like that to clear up your visibility of the screen. And last but not least, the avatars, right? I'd like to ask everybody to use small or normal human-sized avatars that are optimized. If you're not sure if your avatar is optimized or not, just pick a default vrchat one. This is for performance sake, so that way everybody will have a smooth frame rate. Thank you very much. Let's do a quick sound check with Nick. Are you audible all right?
Seems legit.
Seems legit. Yeah. Amplification. Let me just do that.
All right. How's this sound?
All right.
Good.
Console. That fixes it, hopefully. Yeah, I appreciate it.
All right. How does this sound?
Definitely much louder. Okay, so we got that working. Yeah, there's some echo coming from Nick's mic. He's not using headphones. It will be gone in a moment. Don't worry about it.
Actually, let me that just a sec.
Yeah, while you do that, I'll just give a quick shout out to our... Oh, sorry. Oh, certain unclear, feel free to ask now. Okay, cool. Then before we actually get started, I promise this is the last thing, the program, right? So Nick will introduce himself, we'll go through the presentation, and if Nick feels the need to do so, he will call the breaks. We'll do them 5 or 10 minutes at a time. At the very end, at least, there will be one break. And we will also do Q&A throughout, probably, because I figure we're going through quite a lot of material today. So yeah, again, Nick, usually we have just one Q&A segment at the end, but if you want to, call earlier ones, feel free. So for anybody watching here or on YouTube, write down your questions so you don't forget about them. After the event, as always, we'll have a casual hangout in the lounge, do some chatting for anybody interested. But don't feel obliged, of course. Okay, that's it. Hear us okay? And then we'll get started. Okay, that's it. Yeah, no complaints there, looks like. So let's go. For being with us today.
All right, my pleasure. So just checking on the sound. How is this sounding to everybody? A little bit better?
It's very clear right now, yeah.
Excellent. So, okay, well, welcome everyone. I've been excited to give this presentation for a while. I'm very happy that the stars have finally aligned to make it happen. So I very much appreciate the venue and the opportunity to come do this for all of you, and I'm excited to be here. So Thanks for having me. I am Nick. I only go by Nicholas on paper. Uh, I have been doing Golden Dawn magic specifically for a little bit more than 20 years now. I so when I was about 12 or 13, I kind of had my first sort of weird encounter, and that left me in the wake. It was very, very uh, tame in comparison to a lot of what I've subsequently encountered in my magical career. But it kind of set me uh, alight with a spark of what was that, and that question, that what was that, like what is going on, what is out there, how does it all work, has been kind of the central preoccupation that's driven a lot of my life since then. So I became very deeply spiritual in my kind of early adolescence, and I grew up Anglican Episcopalian, and so I got all of the lovely ceremonial of the Catholic Church, and not a lot of the doctrinal baggage, fortunately. Uh, but as time went on, and I progressed into my mid and later teens, I was serving as an acolyte, considered becoming a priest at one point, and eventually realized that, I can appreciate all of the things that I'm saying I believe in here, but what do I actually mean by that? Like, can I really claim to believe this in good faith? And from there, I just kind of started questioning everything and looking for answers farther afield. And so this has led me to a brief flirtation with the Wiccan form of neo-paganism, generically speaking, in the 90s. Uh, but ultimately, I found that I was far too stuffy and uptight to do magic in rhyming verse. That was really the crux of it. It's like, no, no, I don't want rhyming couplets. Give me Latin. So, uh, being of the background that I was, I of course gravitated towards the Golden Dawn, because where else can you get all of that lovely pageantry and ceremony and symbol and ritual and the mythos of it all, and yet, also have the self-driven kind of esoterically minded pursuit, right? So, landing in the Golden Dawn tradition, like that was when I was in college that I kind of uh, more strongly gravitated towards that and found like, oh, hey, this is pretty awesome. Like my initial impressions of the Golden Dawn as a system were that it was very Byzantine and overwrought and really overcomplicated and just could use a lot of streamlining and simplification. That's not necessarily entirely an incorrect take on things, but it's a very unnuanced one. And I've come to really deeply appreciate all of the complexity and the richness of the tradition over the years. So I got started doing neophyte through the self-initiatory curriculum that the Ciceros had put out not long before at that point in the 90s. And then from there, I graduated with a degree in religious studies from the University of Oklahoma in 2005. Went out to North Carolina, did a year of graduate coursework at Duke before realizing that the profession of academia was not all it's cracked up to be, and burning out and deciding to take my humanities degree and put it to fine use in the field of IT. So uh, that that has been kind of a parallel pursuit in my life, and I'm kind of giving you the backstory on me because my sentiment and kind of a theme that runs through this presentation, that it's really difficult to separate the story and the presentation and the meaning of it from the character and the presenter and the people involved. that relational aspect, I think, of this tradition is one of the most fascinating things about it to me, and one of the things that I've been looking forward to exploring the most with you all. So this kind of gives you a bit of a lens into kind of my own perspective, where I come from, biases that I might have, and also just kind of like why you should care. So working in IT like these days, it's funny because I'm sure you see me here with my very style and default avatar, and see me jankily navigating the user interface, and I probably come across as being rather of the level of technical adeptness that somebody about twice my age might have. In reality, by day, I'm a computer hacker. So the joke, of course, being like, I am a VR enthusiast in theory, but when it comes to actually navigating the user interface, I feel like, what the hell am I doing? But pretty much, I always feel like, what the hell am I doing? And I'm just trying to figure it out, which is very much like the esoteric inclination, I think. We are all seekers on the path. We're all trying to figure it out. And at the end of the day, we're all just kind of trying to make sense of this thing. So I decided in approaching this to do this presentation a bit differently. Uh, I am a very visual person. I like structured content and flow. And this was very typically overwrought in my head. I'm a Capricorn with Aries rising. Anything worth doing is worth overdoing, and so I typically go a wee bit overboard and have to draw myself back. So in approaching this, recognized, okay, like, you are all people who are already familiar with this tradition. Like, you're here because you are drawn to it just like me. You don't need another overview of like the chronological timeline of the Golden Dawn. You don't need a recapitulation of the same events and the same cast of characters that you've already had paraded in front of you before. That is the kind of thing that you can get from any number of books. But the valuable thing to me, and what makes it so fascinating, is the context and the unique cultural and historical moment in which the Golden Dawn arose, and the way in which that then proceeded to shape effectively all of Western culture that came thereafter. So one of the things that I think, certainly for myself, like, there is a vast amount of Golden Dawn history, and the complexity and the nuance of the various dramas and interpersonal conflicts and the various historical threads that kind of weave together and do their dance, and then kind of decompose into their own sort of tributary streams. Like, that is what's that's what's most fascinating to me. It's those inflection points, like those relational things that you can tease out, like the why does it matter. So that's what this presentation largely is. I'm not focusing as much on a comprehensive treatment of the subject. I will be touching on certain talking points. I have a sequence and a flow to this, but for the most part, I'm going to be kind of setting the stage, and then we'll just sort of take a journey together, touch on a few of the highlights with the recognition that we are looking to cover some of the most important ground, but we're not looking to do so exhaustively. I realized that there was way too much in any given area of this to really do it justice. So my intention for today is to, rather than giving you an info dump of data, I want to give you perspective. I want to give you the perspective of why did the Golden Dawn arise when it did? What are the historical and cultural developments that shaped it, that primed the stage to allow this strange and beautiful and wonderful thing to come into being in a time and in a place when it was uniquely poised to do so. And then from there, how has it filtered into the wider culture in a way that was vastly outsized for what it was? So, with that in mind, I'm gonna skip ahead here and let's see, bring up my presenter notes. All right. So, the Victorian era and modern Britain in general is an incredibly interesting time, culturally, historically. And in the twilight of that Victorian era, amidst this world grappling with the clash of science and spirituality as understandings of the way that the world works transformed, sometimes seemingly overnight, a secret society quietly arose that was destined to leave an outsized and indelible mark on the landscape of Western esotericism going forward. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a society of seekers and visionaries, dared to tread the path between the seen and the unseen, and to stride the liminal ground between pre-modern magic and the industrialized modernity of 19th century Britain, weaving a tapestry of magic, symbolism, and ritual that continues to inspire and intrigue both seekers and students of occult history and culture to this day. The Golden Dawn wasn't born in a vacuum. It emerged from a rich and fertile ground of intellectual and cultural tumultuousness and ferment, drawing inspiration from a disparate palette of influences. From the structured initiatory ritual of Freemasonry to the mystical allure of ancient Egypt, from the profound wisdom of the Qabalah to the burgeoning spiritualist movement, the Golden Dawn synthesized a unique blend of esoteric traditions. But it did so not as a disjointed potpourri, but rather as a fantastically complex symbolic language, composed of a set of complementary and interdependent concepts that interrelate in highly precise and intricate ways. In many respects, it mirrored in the microcosmic scale many of the innovations and ambivalences of the larger context of Victorian London out of which it arose. To truly understand the Golden Dawn, beyond merely recounting events and parading around a familiar cast of characters, first we have to immerse ourselves in the worldview and mindset of Victorian Britain. We have to commune with the spirit of the age, as it were, or perhaps l'esprit du temps, in order to truly develop a full and nuanced picture of the order's history and subsequent impact, and thereby to turn the two-dimensional images of history into a vivid and living history. The spirit of the Victorian age was one of an era marked by rapid industrialization, social and economic upheaval, and a deep yearning for spiritual meaning. It was a time of great contradictions and paradoxes, where scientific advancements challenged traditional beliefs. People's understandings of the world continually struggled to adapt to new information and perspectives that fundamentally altered people's experiences of life. The allure of the exotic and the ancient beckoned from the shadows, and the constant swell of change and upheaval inspired as much optimism as it did horror, dread, and nostalgic yearning. In this fertile ground, the seeds of the Golden Dawn were sown in darkness, silence, and mystery. So, in this hour, we will take a journey together through the Golden Dawn's captivating history and its prehistory, exploring the cultural and historical context that gave birth to the order and the driving forces and challenges that spurred its creation and development. We'll trace its trajectory from its inception to its eventual fragmentation and diaspora, and examine its enduring legacy in contemporary occultism. So, join me now as we unveil the mysteries of the Golden Dawn and discover the alchemy of ideas that continues to inspire so many of us seekers today. This is a broad overview of the flow of this presentation, so I'm introducing it right now. Probably doesn't need saying, but you know. we're going to set the stage of Victorian Britain, the developments that happened in the 19th century, some of the major cultural shifts, get a perspective, a window into the mindset and the cultural attitudes of the time, and the particular challenges that they were dealing with culturally at that moment in history. From there, we'll talk a bit about the immediate antecedents and kind of ancestors of the Golden Dawn. We'll talk a little bit about some of the older things like Agrippa, Renaissance Hermeticism, etc. But for the most part, I'm interested in the occurrences that happened more or less in the century leading up to the founding of the Golden Dawn in 1888. So from there, we'll talk a little bit about the Golden Dawn as it existed as an original order from 1888 to the schism in 1900. I will largely touch on bits and pieces of that history, not really attempt to do it a cohesive justice. I think that's the sort of thing where we can dig into that a bit in a future session. But for the moment, my emphasis right now is largely on the cultural and historical context out of which the Golden Dawn arose and its legacy, and the way in which the tradition has continued to permute and to reinvent itself as the decades have gone on since 1900. So from there, we'll talk a little bit about the early diaspora, the fracturing of the Golden Dawn into Mathers and the Yates-Felkin camps. We'll talk about a few of the minor offshoots, and then ultimately the publication of the order papers, first by Crowley in the Equinox, and then by Israel Regardie in the Golden Dawn. From there, we will kind of trace its evolution a bit through the 20th century, and we'll wind up in the modern era when you have a bit of a new Golden Dawn renaissance that's been spurred by the internet and has significantly changed not only the landscape of the tradition, but also the composition of the students and the particular challenges that are faced by those of us who want to work this path in a manner that is often very different from the context and the environment in which it arose and which uniquely facilitated that work. The disjunction between the origins of the tradition and the way that it was originally intended to be worked, and the opportunities and avenues that we as today's students have to pursue that kind of Golden Dawn work in that very kind of brick and mortar traditional order way. That is something that has been a significant challenge in the 20th century, and something that we can dive into a bit in terms of how that exerts evolutionary pressures on the modern tradition. So we'll cover a few of the kind of recent developments in Golden Dawn history. But along the way, this is a journey and an exploration. And the biggest thing that I want to do is to help you understand how the pieces fit together, why they matter, what the meanings are that we can distill out of them. So rather than a collection of facts, I hope that by the time this presentation is done, you'll leave with a perhaps less trivia focused knowledge of the tradition, and more a changed perspective or a deepened appreciation for some of the background details and the various kind of confluences of inspiration and intellectual tradition that gave rise to this tradition that we love so much. So, setting the stage of Victorian Britain. This was a very fascinating time in the one of the central defining elements of the 19th century, the inflection points, was in the 1850s when Charles Darwin published Origin of Species. The idea that that humanity was not at the center of creation in some sense, had an existential impact on the psyche of the culture that was a much more personal reflection of the displacement that happened centuries earlier when the scientific perspective shifted from the geocentric to the heliocentric theory of the universe. It was a time in which people felt great technological optimism because of all of the scientific advancements that were being made. There was a great swell of interest in history, natural history especially, and in ancient cultures. And at the same time, there was a deep and profound sense of alienation and dissonance and displacement. You'll probably recognize that a lot of those themes hold salience in the modern day. The more things change, it seems, the more they stay the same. And there are a lot of those aspects of Victorian culture that actually find reflection in today's society and in our own modern challenges as well, even though the details of our contemporary life are very, very different than they were about a century and a half ago when the Golden Dawn was started. This was an era before electricity. The gaslight, widespread artificial gaslight, was still relatively novel. And the relationship that people had with their environment, with the neighborhoods and societies in which they lived, had not yet shifted in the same way that it has in the 20th century, away from an agrarian economy to a more urban and industrialized one. Although the Industrial Revolution was in full sway and certainly picked up even more over the 19th century. So in many respects, you see with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of the snowball effect that seems to have continued through the present day of technological advancement at an ever accelerating pace. It was a heady time, it was exhilarating, and yet also terrifying. You can see that coming through in things like literature. The Gothic novel was created during this time, which, much like cyberpunk fiction, for example, of the late 20th century, expressed a deep ambivalence, a sense of societal and cultural displacement. It reflects the simultaneous optimism and hope for a better scientifically driven future, while at the same time articulating the horror of the concept of a mechanistic reality, of a mechanistic universe that is devoid of the personality of spirit and of connection that largely characterized the spiritual mode of pre-modern society. This transition from pre-modern society into modernity is, I feel, one of the central dilemmas that magic as a spiritual path fundamentally attempts to patch. Our way of human life as a species, especially in industrialized cultures, is vastly different from the overwhelming amount of human experience as a species. The way that we live our lives now is so far removed from anything that our ancestors 100, 200, 300 years ago would have recognized, that it's very difficult to overstate. That was also true in the Victorian era, perhaps not quite as much, but it was a period in which that displacement and that dissonance between the pre-modern modes of thinking and the nascent modernity and the emphasis on things like historicity, historical fact, scientific objectiveness, verifiability, like the way that we construe knowledge and that we perform inquiry into the world around us, these all fundamentally changed. And in doing so, it had some disruptive impacts on the way that we as a society pursued our spirituality. Very much changed the way that we engage in that aspect of our lives. So you saw a kind of a dual tendency here, and this is something that I think you frequently see in cultural and historical moments that are characterized by deep ambivalence. On the one hand, you had this optimism toward progress, toward individual development, toward like the idea of almost an Aristotelian teleology, like the idea that evolution and progress and advancement have an end goal that they're driving toward intentionally. At the same time, you saw the rise of the Romantic movement in literature and art, and various other kind of nostalgic and romanticizing trends, which in the discomfort and in the displacement caused by the unfolding of change, people found comfort and found meaning, and I think a partially mythologized and idealized past as the solution to a future that was bereft of meaning or of spiritual life. At the same time, you also saw an explosion of new modes of religious inquiry, new religious movements, the founding of the Theosophical Society. You had the founding of the Hermetic Society by Anna Kingsford shortly before the Golden Dawn. There was the emergence of spiritualism, of mesmerism. You had numerous attempts to harmonize and to reconcile the spiritual concept and theory of the world with the scientific one, and to frame the two in terms of each other often. You can see that taking shape most prominently, perhaps, with Aleister Crowley's scientific illuminism, his concept of the aim of the aim of religion, the method of science. And you can see that in the emergence of psychical research applying modern, at the time, scientific methods toward the study of spirituality. You can see the legacy of that even today in fields such as neurotheology that studies the neurophysiological responses of people during religious experience and attempts to account for what happens in the brain in relation to those experiences. Ultimately, one of the things that studying a great deal of critical theory and different lenses through which we can approach the enterprise of religion has taught me is that by and large, the descriptors, like the lenses that you use to evaluate these things, all tend to be fairly complementary. It's rarely an either or, it's usually a both and. The difficulty is in knowing how widely applicable, like how far you can apply those lenses before you end up with the problem where you have a hammer and everything looks like a nail. So I find that a bit of productive clutter, a bit of, throwing some wrenches into the gears and saying, well, why not this? Well, why not both? Is often a productive way to go about approaching these things. So, backing up a bit, in the Victorian era, you had the emergence of first wave British feminism. That was a profound influence on the emergence of the Golden Dawn, which was, of course, the first magical society and one of the few paramasonic societies at the time to admit men and women as equals. The population of the early Golden Dawn was very fascinating. It was largely composed, of course, of esoteric Freemasons and also of, we'll call them bohemians, theater kids, basically. A lot of the original Golden Dawn folks were theater kids and creatives and people who were at the subcultural forefront, the vanguard of their era. Today, the Golden Dawn is almost synonymous with the old guard, with tradition, with, you know, that which is stuffy and antiquated in magical religion. And we have to remember that at the time, this was utterly revolutionary, not just in terms of the way that it looked culturally, but also in terms of the very approach to the synthesis of the disparate strands that Mathers and Westcott and Woodman drew upon in order to harmonize them into a coherent and unified system, which was vastly different from anything that came before. I think it's easy in the outsized impact that the Golden Dawn has had to lose sight of how revolutionary some of those introductions were. And so we'll touch on a bit of that and kind of instill a bit more appreciation for just how unusual and groundbreaking a lot of these things were at the time. But let's see here. Let me just consult my notes for a moment. All right, so leading up to the British occult revival, you had the French occult revival, and you had Eliphas Levi, of course, was perhaps the central figure of the French occult revival. The publication of Dogme et Rituel de la Haute Magie, translated into English as Transcendental Magic by Arthur Edward Waite, was a seminal publication that really, it was in some ways groundbreaking, but more so in terms of laying the abstract theory around which the detailed flesh of the Golden Dawn system would be hung. There was a transition during this time away from the pre-modern ideas of magical agency when it came to intercessory spirits and to the essential innate properties of things like metals or stones or plants, toward a concept of magical ontology that worked primarily around the will and the directed, focused, imaginative intent. That was something that didn't start with Levi, but it was popularized by him, along with the concept of the astral light as a somewhat equivalent to, phlogiston or ether, or was a fluidic medium of sorts that was said to be able to be acted upon by the will. So this theoretical underpinning, like this idea of the theoretical mechanics of how this works on a very abstract level, ended up really shaping a lot of how magic got conceived going forward. It really got enshrined in the Golden Dawn, and for quite some time. And really, like, you can see the impacts of this reaching as far as Christian Science and things like The Secret or the Da Vinci Code in the modern day. The idea that you can exert creative pressure on your environment simply by willing something to be so, by changing the way that you think about it, changing the way that you perceive it, was something that the Golden Dawn really drove significantly, in much the same way that in the early to mid 20th century, you saw a great trend toward the psychologization of magic. So these kind of coexisting and also competing ontologies that get emphasized differently is a very large part of the innovation of the Golden Dawn. And again, something that I want to drive home is that in this kind of positing of a will-based ontology of magic, it's not necessarily supplanting or discounting the ideas of spirit intercession or of the essential virtues of things. Generally, it's exactly the opposite. It's just a matter of emphasis. How much focus are you giving to it? And where are you putting the relative weighting of the priority, right? So you have this broad picture of a society in upheaval and of a culture that is looking both ahead and revolutionizing things, prizing individual growth and like individual choice and agency, at the same time that it is desperately seeking a return to the past, to a pristine era where spiritual knowledge was more perhaps intact than it was considered to be at the time. This was really set on fire when Champollion, early in the 19th century, managed to translate the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Prior to that, the best attempt at translating the Egyptian hieroglyphs had been Athanasius Kircher back in the 16th century, who made a very good effort, but it was equally wrong. So having the access at that time to what ended up becoming a flood of new information about ancient Egypt, about the oldest human, like some of the oldest human recorded history, like the earliest that you can get. Like this was synonymous in many ways to the Victorian mind with religious truth. You go as far back as you can. You see like what the source was before things kind of declined or went astray of that original pristine truth. And so this sparked a rabid Egyptomania in Victorian Britain that really lasted the rest of the century. Like the the fact that those of us who are in the Golden Dawn tradition generally kink pretty hard on ancient Egypt is a real reflection of the way that all of Victorian Britain really responded to kind of this cultural moment. It was like the I'm I'm actually failing to think of a suitable kind of cultural equivalent that would be that iconic. But Egyptomania really set Britain on fire culturally. It sparked a wave not only of renewed zeal for historical research and spurred the increasing professionalization and specialization of things like the social sciences, and historical method and things like that, but also really drove popular interest and investment in uncovering those relics of history. So for a long time, you had Egyptian artifacts entering the British Museum basically as quickly as the Brits could steal them. Because, there are no shiny marbles that you can come across without saying, hey, those belong in my museum. That is the empire. So you have this intriguing situation as well with Britain as a political power, where they are more or less at the height of empire, and yet also are still reeling from the Revolutionary War when America broke with Britain. They still are dealing with the political upheaval and with conflict in Europe. There is this grandiosity to the empire of Victorian Britain, mixed at the same time with a sense of precariousness and of that empire kind of slipping through the fingers. And so once again, kind of this duality of mindset really ends up leaving an imprint on the way that a lot of Victorian society and culture expresses itself. So before we continue on to kind of the more direct antecedents of the Golden Dawn as an organization, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to kind of take some breaks in between the broad thematic sections to just open it up for questions. And also, like, I know I tend to kind of talk on for a while, but feel free to, it's like if you need to ask a clarifying question, feel free to ask. Like, this is your session as much as mine. I much prefer to kind of have a dialogue and, a conversation rather than just talk at people. So I'm going to open the floor for questions or comments or, any kind of conversation that you want to have for the moment, and then we can kind of transition into the next section from there.
Yeah, sounds great, Nick. How about a 5-minute break too, maybe after this Q&A section? Would that be okay?
That sounds great. I was actually just stealing the moment to take a drink because my mouth is dry after all this talking.
Yeah, I forgot to mention this earlier on, but we also usually just do 1 hour and then 5-minute break, and then repeat, just for anybody who might need a moment to organize all this volume of information that's going in. So yeah, let's do some questions now. So ask your question. Put the question in here. So far, it doesn't seem like anybody's lining up, so I'll go right ahead then. Let me flip up my notes 1 second. Yeah, if this is something that you'll be going into, or any of these questions, feel free to let me know, and we'll just hold off until then. But I was thinking, given the era of Victorian Britain, probably lots of poverty and disease. I was just curious. I actually never asked myself this question or bothered to investigate. Is there anything you can say about how the Golden Dawn members, or maybe the organization itself or its philosophy, are related to poverty in a general sense, or maybe a group of people who are not as well off? Because I imagine that at the time there was still much more snobbery going around than now, to put it lightly. Very strong divisions between poor and powerful and rich and all that. So I was curious if there's anything you can say about that.
Oh, absolutely. Like it is absolutely a part of what kind of shaped the composition of the Golden Dawn and why it looked the way that it did. So a rise, like of course, the primary, perhaps, like direct influence on the Golden Dawn was the explosion of paramasonic societies and fringe Masonic societies in 19. The Freemasonry was very well established by that point, and it took on a role, particularly so in the 19th century. You saw the rise of a more robust English middle class. So you had people who had leisure and money and the privilege to be able to devote that where they wanted to. And for much of that, like Freemasonry and Masonic lodges and their offshoots became a sort of communal man cave of the 19th century. And it was very much a man cave. It was a highly gendered thing. And of course, given the outgrowth of the Golden Dawn around Masonic structure and influence, the membership was similarly largely composed of middle class and we'll say like edging on perhaps lower middle class. But you can see some of the tensions of the economic disparities in Victorian society just in kind of the patronage relationship that Mathers had, where he essentially relied on the largesse of his benefactor to subsidize his daily living, and that is a slippery slope that you have seen in the 20th century a number of less successful orders and people who run them adopt. So the difficulty of devoting your life and your avocation to magic while also being able to get by in society and earn a living has always been kind of a challenging venture. So the financial pressures and thumb screws of power that kind of served to that Mathers and by extension the entire context of the Golden Dawn as an organization really were founded upon, like that insecurity and the precariousness of it and the inevitable kind of hard feels that arise around friends and money really exerted a lot of additional pressure on the interpersonal dramas that took shape within the order and directly led to a lot of the increasingly authoritarian behavior that you saw come out of Mathers during the time, and that really drove a lot of the conflicts that ended up pushing things to a crisis and breaking point. So that economic instability and insecurity and upheaval ended up sort of poisoning the well in many respects of the Golden Dawn as an original order. But just from a cultural perspective, for the most part, the people who were in the Golden Dawn were people who were mostly people of means, educated and who were reasonably well-to-do. I mean, those of us who pursue this path know that, like, you've either got to be rich or crafty in order to make it work. There's a reason why so much of this path is magical arts and crafts. And I think a lot of that, I think a lot of that, as a bit of an aside, does have to do with the fact that so many of the original members were theater kids and were used to doing things like, prop design and costuming and, all of that. Like those were skill sets that existed back in that time. With the population that really enabled the system to look the way that it did and does. So apart from that, like you had to have like there are a few things that kind of flow together. First off, there's just the societal expectations and the genteelness of Victorian society. Like we think of Victorian society as being incredibly proper and very formal and very insistent upon protocol and decorum. That was very true of upper class society, of London high society. And of course, like the newly moneyed, who generally want to emulate the people who already have the money, tend to govern themselves by those societal rules. People who are of lower economic statuses, there has always been less societal stricture and less societal censure on those who depart from or violate those social norms. So you have this population in the Golden Dawn membership that was drawn largely from that kind of privileged middle class that had the means and the leisure time with which to essentially pursue a life of academic monasticism is the way that I kind of like to think of it for myself. It is not religious orders, but the dedication that is required is very much a priestly and academic kind of devotion that requires a lot of your life. A lot of people who were not of that socioeconomic status simply didn't have the opportunity. They didn't have the social connections either. And before the existence of the Golden Dawn, or even its name, was common knowledge, it was really who you knew and how well you fit in. So it was very much a word of mouth and social network kind of thing. And of course, people tend to congregate around others who are like them. So you did see kind of a broad similarity of composition, or at least like a few kind of emergent clusterings of demographic, I guess, in the original order. So yeah, the economic issues that Victorian society faced were never really addressed quite as explicitly, perhaps, or at least as visibly as something like gender equality, or the ethical treatment of animals with the Mathers's anti-vivisectionist, political pursuits and things like that. But it was something that, while tacit, really, I think, impacts a lot of that the way that it looked, like the reason why it ended up looking the way that it did. So a lot of that did come down, I think, to economic means, to privilege, to leisure, the ability to travel, the access to resources, all of that. So the Golden Dawn has never really, like, it has always been a bit of a tradition of the privileged. But then this is also true of magic. And look back at the 15th century, and when literacy itself wasn't as widespread, who were the magicians? It was largely the educated priestly underclass that didn't really have a lot to do, because how many priests can you make and how many churches do you need to fill? And so you ended up with this kind of mischievous clerical underground of people who were well educated, had too much time on their hands, and liked doing the weird stuff. So, you know, the
Yeah, maybe
the ability
something
to
though.
pursue these things, I think.
I'm curious. Like
Yeah, go
the
ahead.
the Masons, for example, are known for their charity. At least nowadays, I'm not sure if that was a thing back then too, or how much of a thing it was. But did the Golden Dawn ever engage in these kind of charity projects, where it was like fundraising or hell, helping the poor or anything like that very explicitly? Anything you know about that?
Not directly. Not directly. It was so. I mean, partly that the charitable work that Masonic lodges do and societies do is an outreach. Like it is an active engagement between the members of the organization and the larger kind of culture in which they reside. The Golden Dawn was so insulated and so kind of walled off and enclosed in its shroud of secrecy that it really kind of precluded any kind of apparent or obvious sort of organized outreach or engagement with that.
Yeah.
Also, by and large, like the male members of the Golden Dawn were generally Freemasons and had that avenue through kind of exoteric masonry. And of course, the church and the social structures of of the circles that women moved in like afforded them similar opportunities as well. So I think by and large, in a way that's similar to like you see this sort of not split or separation, but kind of a distinction in modern magic generally between magic and religion in the sense of like, a lot of magicians will say, well, if you want to become a better person, don't learn magic, go to church. That's for religion, that's not for magic. And I find that there are some concerns or issues that I have with that perspective, but at the same time, like it is a way of addressing the problem. You compartmentalize it into different areas. And so having that opportunity to kind of achieve those goods through the other structures and the other kind of social supports and avenues that were in their lives, it just wasn't really a demand that exerted pressure on the Golden Dawn, I think, in order to find that sort of expression. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Although I guess it does maybe speak a little bit on the part of those individuals that were members, the fact that they had these other things going on and all. That's pretty interesting. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Well, that's one of the things that yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that you can see this very much like in the profiles and in the persons of the early cast of characters of the Golden Dawn, and it seems to remain just as true like today. Everybody that I know of, everybody that I have met who follows this tradition, everybody kind of has their own niche. The Golden Dawn system is so incredibly broad and covers such a range of things that it's almost like the curriculum of the knowledge lectures and the memorization, all of the intellectual work that you have to do to meet the rubrics for advancement in the outer order is very much see how best to put it here. It's very much like a broad-based liberal arts degree or like general education requirements in a university. It gives you a superficial, broad introduction to a set of core competencies that gives you just enough information to kind of know how things work and to be able to pursue information further on your own. But everybody has their own like things that they nerd about, things that they are excited about. Like, one person will be a specialist in tarot, another person will be a specialist in laboratory alchemy, like somebody else will, be a primarily like a magical crafts person. And there are people who are have all sorts of niche interests that they and extracurriculars, I guess, that are outside of the bounds of like what is traditionally included in the Golden Dawn tradition, and yet in bringing in that diversity of background perspective, it informs and enriches the way that they participate with it, and it kind of serves to cross-pollinate a lot. So you have this phenomenon in which you've got a lot of people that have a shared kind of common symbolic and magical and mythic language, and that are able to kind of speak the same language, to be on the same kind of page operational, and yet who all kind of bring their own different lenses to the table. And even within like the modern major strands of Golden Dawn tradition, like if you look at the Zaleski lineage, for example, coming out of Fairy Ra, like that, the emphasis that Zaleski places on kind of the astrological correspondences and the astrological elements of meaning in the initiation ceremonies, things like that, like the amount of emphasis on like energy dynamics that you really don't see mentioned that much in other offshoots of the Golden Dawn tradition. Like all of these things that the universe seems, for better and for worse, to speak to us in the language that resonates most with us. So I don't think it's any accident that, for example, you know, Enochian looks the way that it does, and well, he was a cryptographer and, you know, a math nerd, and I'm very much not. You know, you have a very aesthetically driven in some ways, and artistically driven kind of approach in the Golden Dawn, particularly in the Inner Order, that reflects a lot of Moina Mather's artistic background, her use of color theory, the touch points of meaning, and the ways that those kind of interpenetrate each other does tend to, like, magic is like, if I had to just encompass magic, like I've written a lot on like, okay, what is a serviceable like academic definition of magic that actually like holds up, something that's a little bit more specified than, you know, will, like true will, you know, it's, but like you can describe what it is. However, I think the way that it largely seems to work, like why it is, magic is a language of meaning. It's a communication between us and everything around us, the environment in which we live, the larger spiritual universe. And so the language that is nearest and dearest to us, that resonates the most with us, tends to be what the universe speaks to us in. So, yeah, you have this the way that the system looks and the way that these things get done, I think does very much reflect the the aesthetics and the sensibilities of its founders and of the people that kind of articulate that. And like the lenses that we impose on it, like we all filter it through our own perceptions. We all filter it through our own kind of senses and capabilities. Like there are some people who are great when it comes to like seeing energy patterns. I am not one of them. Like I could not tell you for a moment like what the particular intricacies of like the energetic currents in a live temple are, beyond like what I can infer from this is how things should work, and this is some weird sensation that I got during ritual. Okay, But, you know, what I do pick up on, for example, myself, took me a long time, but I get a lot more like emotive impressions from if I'm reading the line of a ceremony, then I will feel like the spirit of the persona of like the god form that is to be delivering that part of the speech, and it just kind of like blows over me. So, we all have our own wheelhouses. We all have our own kind of areas where we see things most clearly and keenly and in ways that are most interesting to us. And it's it is largely, I think, the cross-pollination of all of those sort of niches and specialties and the intersecting and interweaving depth that commingles with the common, like the shared breadth that really, I think, contributes a lot to the richness of the tapestry of the Golden Dawn. So that was a very, very long-winded unpacking of that explanation. But
Yeah, appreciate it.
hopefully it was worth the wait. So.
That's what we're here for, yeah. Thank you very much. Well, there is one question from the stream which I think we can treat very briefly. Val Madness is asking where the first Golden Dawn temple, the Isis Urania temple, was in England, and whether or not it can somehow still be located on Google Earth. Maybe the actual building or the location. Do you know anything about this?
Well, actually, this is a really easy one, as it turns out. So the Golden Dawn originally met in Mark Mason's Hall, which is a historic Freemasons Hall in London. And like I have seen some of the pictures of the inside. It is utterly gorgeous. It is also like the kind of space that ain't nobody got these days. So one of the ways in which the Golden Dawn tradition has changed significantly is that by and large, instead of meeting in Masonic temples, now you're meeting in temples that are run out of somebody's basement or somebody's home. So like that's a significant part of it. Like the temples that we have today in the tradition are generally, I wouldn't say like they're more ephemeral, but really it's you don't have the same space set apart for that exclusive use in the same way that you did. When the Inner Order was created, the Vault of the Adepti had to be housed elsewhere because there wasn't space for it, and also, that's not the kind of ritual equipment that you can just set up and tear down in Mark Mason's Hall when the Masons aren't using it. So, yeah, so that had to be housed elsewhere. But in terms of like where the original ceremonies were performed, where it kind of all got started, that's where it was. So very easy to locate on a map. And someday, hopefully, I will have a chance to go to London and see it. But
Yeah, thank you very much. Val says, great answer. Yeah, so there you have it, Val. You could Google it and even travel there if you'd like to. Yeah, thank you very much, Nick. So there's... go ahead. Oh, are you AFK? Swerve? I think Swerve might be AFK.
It's okay. We're all a little AFK.
Right. Yeah, really briefly maybe to add on to the last question, right? I kind of like the technological, mechanical developments from the time. Of course, it wasn't great for everybody. And I'm sure that just as you have now and as you have had in certain periods in recent history, there are movements that or individuals that embrace technology, or there's people who reject it, or anywhere in between. They get specific about it, they get very general about it. Is there anything you could say about how the Golden Dawn or its members related to these emerging technologies of the time? Were they positive about it? Were they afraid? Did they have well weighed out philosophical arguments? I'm very curious if you have anything to say.
So this is something that I have come to a much more nuanced appreciation of, I think, myself in the last year or two, as far as like the how best to phrase it, the I guess the interrelationship of the tradition and how we construe the Golden Dawn tradition as a tradition, and yet also engage with that as technology continues to progress. And like, so for me, my aesthetic wheelhouse, like for a very long time, I guess as much as I am an enthusiast of two things in my life, being like magic and religious philosophy on the one hand and technology on the other, for the most part, I never really wanted or cared to cross those streams. They just didn't really mesh gracefully for me. It's like I, I was drawn to the Golden Dawn tradition for a reason, you know. Electric lighting is something that people regard with suspicion, you know. And so I think for I think a lot of the magical enterprise, a lot of the magical kind of sensibility is often in kind of finding this sweet spot for ourselves between, okay, what's something that is old enough, like has enough kind of history and yet also enigma around it, and that, you know, is so far enough removed from our everyday kind of waking life, you know, this is how we talk, this is how we do stuff, that it sets it apart and renders it sacred. Like my as a very brief digression, like one of my favorite authors in religion is Mircea Eliade, he ran the University of Chicago's religion department in the mid 20th century, and within a few decades, most of the leaders of like top religion departments in the country were his students. He had a very large impact, but one of his seminal works, The Sacred and the Profane, its central thesis was around how effectively the way that we create sacrality, the way that we render something sacred for ourselves, is by setting it apart from everyday usage. Like we treat this thing as special because reasons. Like we use antiquated modes of speech because it is set apart from our daily life. Like Latin becomes a magical language instead of just, you know, the convenient lingua franca of, you know, the educated class, because it is something that is not in current mundane use, really. It's like for similar reasons, it's like I shave with a straight razor and occasionally I listen to vinyl, and those aren't things that I really would have cared doing much for if those were my only options. But, you know, when you're removed enough from the immediacy of it, those things become luxuries. Your relationships. So, returning to the point now that I've kind of made the setup here. For me, like those streams of magic and technology never really crossed. And so I didn't really give it a lot of thought. You know, it's like I can comfortably partake in, you know, my magical drug of choice without having to, you know, deal with all of this weird like internet chaos stuff. But as I became a bit more appreciative of kind of the ways in which, you know, from our perspective today, we see the emergence of the ethos and the approach of the Golden Dawn as being traditional, as being, you know, well established, as being kind of this sort of foundation stone on which we can build. At the time, that was not at all the case. Like, the methodology of the Golden Dawn was radically different from so much of what had come before. Like it drew traditional elements, but it recombined and synthesized those in ways that were in many cases extremely novel. Like the use of abstract geometry and lineal figures, for example, like in the tracing of the pentagrams in the LBRP, that's new. You know, you saw the circumscription of a magical circle with like a sword or something like that in the grimoire tradition, but this idea of using the abstract virtues of, you know, of polygrams and of, you know, other geometric figures as having this magical significance, this operant kind of capability, was very new. Similarly, you know, you did see a lot of application of what, you know, in, like, for the time, one kind of has to recognize as advances in technology. Again, like going back to Moynihan's color theory, you know, that was something that was, you know, current at the time. And so I look at the ways in which the tradition has changed and stayed the same over the intervening time between 1900 and the present. And I think that as a tradition and as a culture, as an initiatory culture, there is a tension that is growing that I think is becoming harder and harder to ignore. You know, like for a while, you know, we were not sufficiently removed, I think, from the original source material to really see the wear around the edges as time progresses. And since then, like, hey man, we've got the internet, we've got computers, like electricity is nothing. It's like we've got artificial intelligence now, what the hell? So I think about the place that the founders of the Golden Dawn and its original membership were at the vanguard of their culture at the time. And I consider, okay, well, if they were the ones who were reinventing this today, what would the tradition look like? What would the incorporation of technological elements be? And this is something that in my own practice I've always kind of flirted with and played around with. It's like I tend to be very, you know, I prize being authentic and, like, historically grounded in the tradition as much as I possibly can. But anybody who has worked the Golden Dawn system ever, whether, you know, as a solo practitioner or in the context of a traditional temple, knows that you always have to improvise. Like you will never have all of the things that you need. You will always find little, like, omissions in the directions. It's like, okay, how should I move during this? Like, okay, wait, now how am I supposed to, like, hold a banner and a sword and a script and read all of this crap? Like the various little gotchas that just never got documented, and you kind of have to fill in the blanks, or, you know, you don't have access to the right materials and you just got to kind of improvise as best you can. Like that improvisational demand, like the disparity between, even going back to like the PGM, between the optimal, like the ideal kind of circumstances or protocol or apparatus or whatever for the magical operation that you're doing, and your actual capability to follow through on that, are usually not going to be in sync. So to some extent, part of, I think, one's growth as a magician is getting to the point of having that kind of comfort and facility in saying, okay, like this is where I have to improvise. This is where I can improvise, and these are the levers that I can tweak where it really doesn't change the outcome, or, you know, this is how I can kind of preserve that intent and that communication of meaning while, you know, making substitutions. Like that's I think part of the way in which we grow as magicians, when we have internalized that kind of foundational language and we're actually using it to create. Now that said, like on a larger scale, I think that tension between the ideal and the real, like there is the disparity that comes of lack of not having something that you need. But then there's also, on the other side, a disparity that gets created by new opportunities that just didn't exist. Like, for example, my just like my altar cross and triangle is like cut out of wood. I actually I cut that thing out on a laser cutter. It's like I used a friggin' laser to make my cross and triangle. Like that is not something that would have been done back in 1888. Like I have I have been to some extent flirting with the use of the cricket as a magical crafting tool. So like these abilities to kind of, it's like the technology that I often end up bringing into my own practice, like just in my life, has generally been of that like sort of second order nature of like, okay, I can use better methods of constructing this thing. Like I can use different kind of materials for it, and I can adapt these materials in these different ways because you know the either the materials do or don't matter to like the actual meaning that's being communicated, and you just kind of like you figure out how to preserve the core of that communication. At the same time, like there's always this tension. So you have that tension of opportunity and the tension of the disparity of not being able to achieve the ideal. And there is a question that just demands to be asked out of that situation that you're naturally confronted with, which is, okay, like to what extent then, as these new capabilities, new sources of information, new research, whatever, becomes available, to what extent do we avail ourselves of them? And to what extent do we preserve the tradition unaltered? Like, to what extent can we incorporate those innovations and like innovate without doing violence to the tradition? And that's something that's really a very deeply personal and different kind of answer, I think, for everybody. It's like there is the question at its root of like what is doing justice to the, right? What does it mean to pay homage to a tradition, or to walk in the footsteps of a tradition, and to make deliberate and well-reasoned changes that enhance without disrupting or without damaging like the very intricate set of interconnections that are already in place. That requires a very deep understanding of how those interconnections work. And like whenever I have to make those sort of alterations, like I'm constantly just like a little bit kind of preoccupied in a way with, it's like, okay, like how can I not screw this up? How can I not like make this bad, right?
Yeah, if I may,
So like
Nick,
that's
I also kind of, or actually specifically intended the question to be, regarding like technology in society, and although you kind of focused on answering in relation to technological advancements in the practice itself and in the tradition itself, I think you did touch on a few points which I imagine might be quite important for Golden Dawn folks at the time, right? Again, not for everybody. The Hermetic philosophies and those offshoots and the thoughts coming out of the occult revival was also stuff that would inform their ethics and morality, right? But if there is anything to be found in the Golden Dawn, I think at the very least you could say it's a kind of mindfulness about the experience you're living, as well as the thing they're continually driving home with your symbolism is like balance and like a moving balance and stuff. So to me, that suggests that they would be just as careful or maybe mindful about whatever interesting developments, technological developments, were emerging and evolving society at the time, right? Some thought. There's some more questions.
That's a perfect way of kind of.
Oh, sorry.
Just to sum up, and to kind of say yes, and I think that's a perfect way of kind of driving it to a point, as far as you have this this kind of tension, right? And you have to figure out how you're going to respond to that. And the primary virtue, the overriding, like the central theme of all of the Golden Dawn work is balance. And it is in finding the sweet spot, middle ground between competing ideas. And that can be much more unintuitive and nuanced when it's not just like an opposition between two ends on a binary spectrum, but rather it's like complementary ideas that seem to disagree but can both be correct at the same time. But either way, like, you've got this tension that you have to navigate, and that's kind of the in a lot of sense, like, that's sort of the core theme of this entire presentation. It's like the tension and duality of opposites, and the ways that those sort of combine together and inflect in order to give rise to and shape like what comes after it. So yeah, again, and in terms of how that spills over, like how those technological advancements spill over into where it kind of flows back into the field. And I think you can see like the adoption of technology and technical methods in operations, like magical operation. You can see that, I think, even more profoundly and in much more subtle ways in the ways that impacts things like magical theory, and in the theories that we create around cosmology and kind of the mechanics and dynamics of reality. So things like the psychologizing model, or the spirit-centered world model, or the information model of magical ontology. Things like the proliferation of kind of modern cosmological narratives that try to incorporate what we understand about quantum mechanics, and inflect on the kind of liminality of the unknown in that arena and the mystery that still exists within it, to kind of find that place where the two can intersect and kind of flow together. Those tensions between what I'll broadly call like progress, like evolution, forward evolution. Not in an intentionally directed sense, although not necessarily not that either, but more so in just like the constant onward march of time. Like, you've got to deal with it somehow. How do you stay relevant? How do you keep up? How do you keep the tradition alive and not just kind of fossilized, encased in amber? So like that largely is, I think, the crux of a lot of the social and intellectual and kind of existential challenges in a lot of ways that the Golden Dawn tradition faces at large today. How do we navigate those complexities? How do we navigate those tensions?
Yeah, very interesting. Well, appreciate it. There were... I see. What was it again? Swerve, did you have a question you would like to ask? Or were you just hanging out over here?
I forgot. Yeah, I forgot.
I'm sorry.
Went to having a question to forgetting.
It's all right. And
That is so sadly relatable to me.
Yeah, it happens.
This is the advantage of having crippling ADD.
And I believe there was somebody else as well. Feel free to come back up here. Ah, go ahead, man.
Can you remember any
Oh, shit.
examples of the Golden Dawn being able to organize action for their community? Does that make any sense, the way I phrased that?
Yeah, so I
You
mean,
know,
it sounds like so. So it sounds kind of like this is.
And make
sort
sure,
of
Swerve, that you don't
touches
have
on-
the microphone enabled while he's answering the question, please. Yeah, thanks.
All right, so I this kind of dovetails on the kind of the earlier question about, I think, that kind of, you know, charity outreach, right? Yeah, your question is basically just kind of about like how and whether, you know, in Golden Dawn history you've seen that kind of engagement with the context of one's wider culture, not before not before Rigardi, you know, I think is the easy answer. I think you can probably, like, in historical, you know, like pre late 20th century Golden Dawn history, you can probably see that kind of outward kind of community and society driven engagement most in very indirect ways in kind of the magical battle of Britain in World War II. Like that is where you see really the greatest kind of magic devoted intentionally towards like societal and political activism. Now, that said, the landscape of the Golden Dawn tradition and the relationship of the Golden Dawn as a tradition to its wider kind of parent culture is very different now than it used to be. Like, the fact that the Golden Dawn is like a thing that people know about, that, you know, it may be obscure, but it's well documented, and that it's like there are a lot of different kind of cultural values around secrecy, magical secrecy, that differ from order to order, from organization to organization. But back in the late 19th century, in addition to any kind of, you know, spiritual virtues that may have been merited in that strict secrecy, there were also a lot of practical considerations. You know, being a ceremonial magician in 1890s Britain was in some ways not that different from being gay in the 1990s. You know, you could potentially lose your job. That was precisely why Westcott got drummed out of the order when his order papers were either, well, when they were found in a London hansom cab, either because he forgot them or because, as some have insinuated, perhaps they were planted there, perhaps by Mathers, because he wanted to kind of like get Westcott out of the way. I don't really have any strong opinions about that, but the kind of upshot of that was Westcott, as a London coroner, was told by his employer, well, you can do this Golden Dawn thing or you can do your job. And he chose his job. So the professional and societal and like personal and financial risk was much greater in being a magician then than it is now. These days, you know, people might look at you funny if you know, live in Oklahoma, where I grew up, and you're surrounded by, you know, fundamentalist Christians of a certain variety. Then, you know, things might be a bit more charged with animosity. But by and large, you're not going to have anything near the same kind of consequences societally that anybody would have in that era. Like, being a magician is like not a big thing now. And so like that creates a much more open canvas as far as like the possibilities for engagement with your larger culture. Like, I think
Perhaps I'm
the ways
giving
in
the
which, yeah,
perhaps I'm giving the founding fathers too much credit here. Perhaps we can thank them for that and the First Amendment. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think you're giving them. I don't think it's that you're giving them too much credit. I think it's more just that the circumstances of the historical and cultural context at the time just precluded that kind of involvement and engagement. Did you hit your mute? Thanks. But yeah, no, I think that it's easy in a lot of ways, and I see this particularly, I think, in younger cohorts in our culture today. Like, it is very easy to look back on previous generations, on persons from a different historical era, and to kind of anachronistically find fault with them for not being more enlightened than they were or progressive than they were. And the fact of the matter is that everybody, we are all products of our own time and culture, far more so than we would care to admit. A significant part of the magical journey is deprogramming yourself from that. And so I think it is not giving more credit than, it's not being overly charitable to recognize, hey, like, there were some, like, this is where the culture was at the time. These were the considerations that were in play at the time. Those are different than they are now. And so, different context, different set of considerations, different expectations have to result. So I think just because of the nature of the beast, because of what it was, like, you didn't really, like, it really shut off that opportunity to have any kind of engagement or dialogue with a wider kind of community, either of a culture or of the society at large. That's not the case today. And one of the things that I would love to see more of, that I actually am really kind of sad that I don't see more of, is exactly that kind of community engagement. Like, we don't still have a lot of, of the relatively few orders that are out there that are of any kind of appreciable size. I don't know of any that have any kind of like organized, process or structure around community engagement, around, community education, around any kind of, you know, we still as a culture and as a tradition tend to be very insular. I do think we have a lot of legacy in that, from kind of the siloedness that results inevitably from that culture of secrecy. So again, kind of existing in that tension and figuring out how do we, especially generally now as like geographically disparate and isolated, practitioners who often don't have the fortune to be near a like major population center that has enough of a concentration of other weird folks like us that we can actually have a functioning temple in our metaphorical backyard. It's like I live in Minneapolis. They call it Paganistan for a reason. Like, this is a weird nexus of OTO folks. Llewellyn is based in St. Paul, and yet, like, when I was a member of the HOGD, I had to drive 4 hours out of state, like, once a month in order to participate, just because, again, like, the population of students is so much more disparate and diverse than the ability of the tradition to kind of find homes for them in geographic clusters. So there's this difficulty that exists, but also at the same time this opportunity that's created by changing times. And I think one of the things that, in order to stay relevant in the 21st century and to continue as a living tradition going forward, I think one of the things we're going to have to reckon with is how do we engage with the larger kind of structures in our culture within the context of occultism or outside of it, in order to just have that basic like ecumenicalism, and in order to just establish the basic kind of social and cultural ties that even like gain people awareness of and interest in the system to ensure that it draws people going forward. So this is like, you have kind of opened a box of worms in a way, with the question without knowing it. But it's a really good question, because I think it really strongly uncovers kind of one of those aspects that you just don't think about being different back then, like in the ways that they are now. And so it provides an opportunity to kind of compare and contrast. And this is like the same kind of question and answer process I do with myself all the time, just kind of trying to, figure out, okay, well, why is this like that? So, really good question. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, thanks, Swerve. I appreciate it. And thanks for that wonderful answer too. Well, it's almost an hour since we said we were going to do a break.
Yeah.
Let's
I was just looking at the time, and it's like I had planned on making this about 60 minutes. Clearly, this is overrun, and like we haven't even really gotten past kind of the 1900 schism, and we've barely touched on like any of the intrigues in the order itself. But I have to say, like this has achieved the end that I desired. Like for the most part, okay, so think about like the different, okay, if you've seen the Harry Potter movies, like the difference in directorial style in the movies is really profound. So like in the sequels, things get a bit darker, things get a bit more intense, and like they unpack all of the storyline. The directorial mood of the first movie is largely like, wow, look at this, isn't this cool? And largely that's kind of what I wanted to come in here and do today, is like be able to just say, hey, isn't this cool? And invite you into that kind of dialogue and into that just reflection on, okay, how did we end up with this from all of this? Like what shaped this? Like where did this come from? It came from somewhere. How can we follow these threads back and see like why it is the way it is, and explain like the dysfunctions that came out of the original order that led to its schism. Why there's so much like, yeah, go ahead.
There's a couple things we could do. We kind of have a tradition here of, planning for a normal quote unquote time and then ending up doing like 5-hour lectures. So some of us here are totally up for that, but I can imagine, maybe that doesn't fit your schedule or whatever. So yeah, you could decide to carry on for a little bit after the break, or end it here and we carry on another time. It's really up to you. Also, right, we have the stream. There's about 20 people watching over there as well. And it also allows people
Nice.
who have to drop out at some point to catch up on what they missed on the stream later, right? So again, we can carry on however long you would like to, or keep it as short as you would like to. I'll leave that up to you. So yeah, any thoughts on that so far? Should we do a break, or
Yeah,
would you
well,
like to end it, or?
so what I'm thinking is, on the one hand, stretching this on for 5 hours sounds awesome. On the other hand, because, I'm me and I chronically over prepare and stress about everything, this is also me on 0 hours of sleep. So there's that. Like, I don't know that I have 5 hours in me.
No, of course,
But
yeah, I understand.
that said, yeah. So that said, also, like, when you and I first talked about this, like, I always try to avoid overcommitting myself, and I always do. But I knew that this presentation would be like there's no way that you're going to be able to do justice to this. And for me, like this has sparked so much desire to dig deeper and to kind of, drill down more granularly into some of these different like dynamic, like different problems that have come up in history, or different like eras of Golden Dawn history, that like I really like, I want to do more unpacking of that in more kind of, organized fashion. But right now, like this was kind of the icebreaker and the hook to kind of suck me in and get me over the various impediments to doing stuff like this in my life, with the enthusiasm of it. So mission accomplished on that front. In other words, like I really want to do more of these down the road, and to kind of devote a bit more directed and focused attention to kind of shining those lights. For right now, though, I feel like, we may not have kind of gotten to the post 1900 diaspora or anything that really touches strongly on the modern tradition, but we've kind of meandered all over the place, and largely like we've surfaced the big themes, and that was my goal in this. So I'm content to maybe, take a short break if we want to open it up for like a general Q&A and just kind of, conversation, take it a bit more unstructured, and kind of wrap up from there. That sounds great to me.
Yeah, sure. Although I will say, no, it goes for me, and I'm sure for much of the audience as well. I'm pretty sure, yeah, many are very interested to hear what you had lined up for the rest of the presentation. So I guess I'll bother you about that on Discord. Hopefully we can maybe schedule another
So many notes.
presentation in not too long, or yeah, we'll see whatever we can
Definitely.
figure out regarding that. Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
before we take a break and then come back, and turns out there aren't so many questions. Let's see. Yeah, does anybody have questions they would like to ask after the break? If so, please jump up, wave your hand, or anything like that. Doesn't look like it. Oh, yeah, we got at least Swerve over there. Actually, I do have one more question in my notes. And yeah, maybe somebody on the
Cool.
YouTube stream still has any. So in that case, let's just take 5 minutes, and yeah, we'll reconvene and do a little more Q&A, a little more chit chat, and yeah, leave it at that. How's that sound?
Sounds awesome.
Okay, cool, let's do it. So take a look at the clock, folks. It's 7 past the hour. So we'll be back here at 12 minutes past the hour. I'll see you then.
Till then, everyone.
Hi.
ね。ライオ機能ないんだね、
This is Frog on the intercom. We're about to continue with the presentation, so please make your way back to the auditorium if you'd like to join. Seems like a bunch of folks are just hanging out in the lounge, so yeah, I think we're good to continue. I guess I'll kick us off. Or is there anything else you'd like to add, Nick, before we get to the Q&A?
No, not at all. Just by all means, ask me anything. This is your time too. So I'm just excited to be here, and yeah, let's chat.
Yeah, so, well, this is not my personal opinion, but something you hear a lot when the Golden Dawn is discussed. You mentioned that you think they did a pretty good job at creating a coherent system, harmonizing different influences, different concepts, and so on. But obviously, there's people who say, they didn't do a good job at all. They ruined it. They lost the original intentions. They got the details wrong. They got the spellings wrong. They got the exotic alphabets wrong, and what have you. So, just curious, what would you say to people who bring that kind of stuff up?
So I think this is another one of those things where the wealth that we have, like the riches that we have at our disposal today, make like they make the resources that were available to even the most well-connected of Golden Dawn founders and students in the 19th century and early 20th century pale in comparison. The amount of access to research papers, to books, to internet sources of information, like the amount, like the degree to which that has changed just in my lifetime alone since I started studying Golden Dawn has been profound. So, my second big, like my second published article was one that I was writing under a pseudonym at the time. It was published in Nick Farrell's Hermetic Tablet. I want to say this was 2017. It was on Coptic names in the Golden Dawn. I don't know a lot of Coptic. However, I know just enough Coptic to know that the Coptic in Rigardi and the Coptic that came out of the original order was a dumpster fire that doesn't even like resemble language a lot of the time. So, that again, that tension between so you have to consider what was the state of Egyptological research at the time. Not good. There weren't a lot of resources on Coptic. And so understanding the ways in which you think they fell short, or the ways in which one does, I think first there is the exercise of challenging your own assumptions and your own preconceptions about what are you assuming about the intentions of the founders and about the resources that they had at their disposal. So, we all kind of do the best with what we can. And I find that it's never helpful to fault people for not knowing information that they had no way of having access to. So, you know, the ways in which the Golden Dawn used Coptic as a magical language is much more akin, perhaps, to the way in which Enochian is used as a magical language than the way in which, say, Arabic is used in the Picatory, right? You know, it was not well understood as a language. However, the function that it served, the benefit that it provided, is that so much of Golden Dawn operant magic, the mechanics of it, was about the use of sound and the voice, and about the tracing of meaningful geometry in the patterns of movement throughout the temple, and the way, like the patterns in which, you know, implements are arranged and officers are arrayed, right? So you have this way in which Coptic served as kind of a phonological bridge of sorts to, you know, provide as close a reconstruction as they could get to at the time, as to what ancient Egyptian might have actually sounded like. And it was in capturing that element of the sound, of the voice, that that element of magical efficacy was harnessed. So if you look at it from that sense, in terms of like what problem were they trying to solve with this? Like, how were they trying to use it? They were very successful in doing it. And certainly, you know, we've had more than 100 years of, you know, these uses of god-awful Coptic names that, you know, in some cases use a letter that isn't even a letter, it's a numeral, for heaven's sake. So, you know, the fact that like there is the historicity of it, and then there's also the, well, it works. So like there's always that tension that you kind of have to be mindful of. And I think in some, like in the larger sense, you kind of have this almost this kind of spectrum of orientation between, you know, very kind of rigid ceremonialists on the one hand, who are very like, it must be by the book, it must be to protocol, and then on the other hand, like I'm going to caricaturize the chaos magic tradition, because like there is definitely a chaos magic tradition, but at the same time, like the stereotype is very much, you know, believe what you want, banish with laughter, and like, you know, venerate Disney pantheons, because why not? So, you know, it's the how much do you innovate versus how much do you throw the baby out with the bathwater, and how rigorously historical are you being, and how much was that actually the point? So, I mean, this gets into a whole big, huge can of worms about a fundamental difference between pre-modernity and modernity, which is like our very ideas of what history is have changed. Like our ideas about what history is today is how closely does this narrative align with the facts, like with the observable reality of what occurred. That was not the way that people looked at history for the vast amount of human existence. It was much less about, did this thing actually happen? And much more about, what did this thing mean? What does it matter? Like, what can it tell us about the world, about, you know, reality around us, and about our relationship to it? And so it's, how do we understand the very thing that we're ourselves? And we, as time goes on, like inevitably, we just grow more and more gradually and imperceptibly divorced from that original mindset, and the original kind of, you know, under the cohesive understanding of, okay, this is what we're doing and why, to, well, this is just the way it's always been done, and why did they do it that way? So you also have to bear in mind, like, okay, so like let's be real here. the Golden Dawn lasted from beginning to end, really. 1888 to 1900. That's 12 years. That is 12 years. That's not a lot of time. So to be able to draw together and synthesize that much, and to be able to do so that intricately in ways that, yeah, I mean, like, there are some rough spots around the edges that need sanding off. Like the tradition always grows through that kind of pursuit. But at the same time, like, you look at what it is, and man, like, are you going to fault the builders of the cathedral for not, including an Olympic-sized swimming pool on the roof? What are your expectations here? So in the span of 12 years, I think that they managed to do an amazing amount. Like the degree to which that was driven by Westcott and Mathers alone, and even like Woodman's contribution. Like, Woodman is often kind of a footnote in Golden Dawn history, mostly because he died so early. His position was never filled, which, again, hindsight, probably a good idea if you have governance via 3 chiefs to, fill the vacant throne when one of them dies, before you have another chief turning autocratic and all of that fun stuff. But lessons of history. Anyway, Woodman is often kind of relegated to a footnote because we just don't know that much about him. But and Mathers's contributions to kind of the mechanics of the system, and Westcott's contributions to the curriculum and the literary aspects of the tradition are so obvious that any contributions Woodman may have made just kind of like get lost in the mix. But the fact that this change was largely driven by just a few people who were building on the shoulders of giants, but at the same time, I find that it is always easier to find fault in the way that other people do something than it is to reconcile that and to do a better job of it. And at the same time, I think that's always kind of the magician's dilemma. We always have this tension between the ideal that we can see, like the world that we would have this world be, and what is. And that discontent, that frustration, that nerd rage is sometimes the thing that has been most productive and fruitful to me in terms of spurring on my own practice and my own research and diving into these questions. So, if you take a dim view, perhaps, of what the Golden Dawn achieved in its 12 years of life, and then in its, subsequent kind of diasporic history, then you're welcome to do that. But at the same time, you've got to recognize, well, that also begs the question, how do you want to do it differently? How do you want to do it better? And I think that drive to do it better, to reinvent the wheel and to make it a more perfect wheel, is in some ways as much a valuable and sacred part of this magical path as any of the study and diligence about ritual practice and about learning the material is. It's like it's the struggle with it, the wrestle with it, that really makes somebody a magician, to me.
Yeah, another great answer. Thank you very much. Well, we have a couple people here with questions. So, yeah, Melon, feel free to go ahead.
I can hear.
Oh, you cut off there at the end, but otherwise the volume and stuff is fine.
Oh,
yeah.
Still no sound?
Can't hear you right now.
Oh, here. If you need a minute to figure it out, let's go to my neighbor's Wi-Fi. Feel free to come up to the mic and ask your question.
Great name.
Yeah, get nice and close. That way the amplification works. Yeah.
All right.
Perfect.
Can you hear me? Well, okay.
I
Great.
can.
Okay, so regarding the Golden Dawn, when the Golden Dawn was established and began to explore magic, what was the primary purpose of their practices? Like, what were they trying to accomplish? I know it was guarding, but what was the benefit of it for them?
So there is the explicit answer, and then there's the what I actually make of the answer. So, like, the explicit answer is, well, they were trying to preserve the mysteries of ancient Egypt and of Greece, like of the classical and Hellenistic era, essentially, in a format that translated them into a mode of encounter that was amenable to the modern British citizen, right? And in a lot of ways, it was like, you have this fascinating kind of abutment where the practical aspects of Golden Dawn magic, things like astral travel and scrying and Enochian and all of that stuff, exist in parallel with the initiatic system, like the mystery religion aspect of it. And those two interweave, but they are, to a surprisingly large degree, separable. So when it comes to the intent of the Golden Dawn, like, really, its whole thing is theurgy. It's spiritual magic. It is the transcendence of the lower self and the communion of oneself with one's inner divine, and the manifestation of that inner divinity into fruition in the outs, like in a way that spills over into the outside world, right? You become a vessel of the light, fill yourself with it, and shine it forth into the world. It's the whole idea. So that's like what it says on the tin. Now, the way that I think that functioned largely for a lot of people is in serving, again, kind of that translational capacity. It's like, you dig enough into the kind of symbolic and religious history, and like the like one of my like real big nerd rabbit holes lately has been Egyptian archaeoastronomy. And there's been a lot of recent research in Egyptian archaeoastronomy that sheds a lot of light on like what the specific like stars and constellations that had reference in the original Egyptian zodiac were, and stuff like that. Like, there's some fascinating research being done, but you see the cyclical themes, you see the kind of ways that symbolism is used in parallel manners, and you can kind of see, okay, like, ancient Egypt and Hellenistic Egypt and classical Greece, all very different from each other, and yet like they share a commonality of overlap in those mystery religions. There are the themes of death and rebirth. There's there are certain consistencies that apply seemingly universally. And my own kind of architectural take on it, I guess, is that in founding the Golden Dawn, in kind of hanging the ritual structure around the skeleton that was provided by the cipher manuscript, essentially the core task, like the function, like the purpose of it, was was really to take a mode of encountering religion that had been around for thousands of years, and yet which society was increasingly just wholesale losing touch with as it moved into industrialization and societal alienation. It's like Karl Marx said that, you know, the defining characteristic of modernity is alienation, and the alienation of ourselves from our ground of being, from our spiritual roots, was profound in Victorian. So I think the larger kind of point was really to provide a means of translating that experience across the years, across culture. You know, like it's easy to like read the Bible in translation and ignore the fact that, particularly if you're American and don't have a really great sense of history to begin with, because our educational system, to forget about the fact that the Bible was not written in English. The Bible was not written by people who saw the world remotely the same way. Like, it was a vastly different time. And even though a lot of things in just the human experience have remained the same, a lot of those things are universal and just kind of part of the essence of what we are as animal beings that kind of transcends culture and time and all of that stuff. But you still have to find a way of speaking that to people, of communicating it to them, and of connecting them to it that resonates with them. And I think the Golden Dawn as an enterprise, as a cultural phenomenon, was really a way of trying to solve that problem, a way of trying to translate the lost knowledge and mythic wisdom of the Egyptian and Eleusinian mysteries into something that spoke to the modern condition and modern age. And I think in that measure, they were largely successful.
All right. Thank you.
Is there someone? Or...
If you have any other questions, feel free to line up at the back again.
Okay, is this any better?
Much better.
Coming through loud and clear.
Okay. I just had two questions, a short one and a long one. The first one is just like I was wondering what your thoughts are on, I guess particularly the LBRP, as that seems to be something that's become quite syncretic, I guess, or maybe that's not the right word, but it seems to be something that's utilized in a lot of different ways. I see it pop up all over the place in many, in form, sometimes very similar to the same form as the original, sometimes modified quite a bit, but oftentimes not even referencing the original history behind it. And I'm curious as to your thoughts on that. And then the second thing would just be, when you brought up Latin in terms of sort of something being older and sacred as it's kind of separate. A lot of what I've been reading about recently in terms of sort of Platonic or Neoplatonic ideals as it relates potentially to magic is the idea that when meaning exists in over and over again over the course of history, if something's older and has been used, over and over again as history goes on, that it's almost like kind of a snowball effect, potentially Neoplatonically. And the Golden Dawn is one of the, recently foundational, as in terms of its effect on, most occult practices, even if they don't know where it's coming from, that they drew from a lot, but kind of coalesced it into a form that now everybody can kind of be utilizing. And so in that sense, those archetypes, those correspondences, those charts and lists, it's like now partially because of them, or in large part, those are now being used and sort of being reinforced in like a Neoplatonic sense, if that makes sense at all. Interested in your thoughts on that.
It does, yeah. Well, and so like you kind of mentioned the LBRP as sort of the emblematic example, and I love that as an example. Like the LBRP really is like, it is so fascinating to me in so many ways. I mean, in part because it was, during in traditional order, like pedagogy, I guess. It's the only practical ritual that was given to outer order initiates. Now, that said, also, like, one of the things that has happened in the 20th century is that you've seen this fascinating kind of phenomenon where, if you look at the amount of time that it took, like, Crowley is a good iconic example, but like Crowley is also precocious. But if you look at the amount of time that it took somebody to advance from neophyte until their 5-6 initiation, generally didn't take that long in the original days. Like it took maybe a couple of years, maybe a couple of and so by and large, the work that you were doing in the outer order was largely one of memorization of language acquisition. You were acquiring the symbolic language, then you moved to the inner order and you use that language to create poetry. So the LBRP is fascinating in that it stands alone in part as kind of this microcosmic representation of how Golden Dawn practical magic works in general. Like it's this kind of, proof of concept almost. And then, it's given with fairly little context. Rigardi adds more to that. However, the context then became kind of broad enough that you see the LBRP sort of slipping into this almost like, magical Swiss Army tool kind of function where people just use the LBRP for everything. And then the lesser invoking ritual of the pentagram. And, there are all of these kind of variant flavors of it. It's like you don't like the Hebrew names, use Greek instead. You can do it Aram Solis style. You feel alienated from Abrahamic religion, replace it with Babylonian or Canaanite god names. And some of the so what's fascinating to me is that in part it is something which runs the risk of trivializing the ritual and of doing it injustice or dishonoring it, but at the same time, so one of my favorite, and of course, just given the influence of, for example, Crowley on Gerald Gardner via the OTO and its impact on Wicca, casting a circle in Wicca is strikingly similar to forming LBRP. And you see all of these kind of fingerprints of intellectual genetic transmission everywhere. One of my favorite iterations of this is called the Lesser Elvis Banishing Ritual of the Sequined Pentagram. It is as ridiculous as it sounds. And one of the things that I love about it, in a manner kind of similar to Discordianism or the Church of the Subgenius, or a lot of kind of the culture of 80s, 90s era chaos magic, you have this playfulness with it. It's a very Hackerly thing to do. It's like you see how it works, and then you toy with it, and you screw around with it. Like, fuck around and find out, to borrow the the phrase that the kids are using these days. So that's how you do it. You play with it, you tweak it, you experiment with it, and you see how it works. And I think in a tradition that it is as rigorously defined and codified as ours, it can be very easy to get hung up on the details of those prescriptions without taking into account the underlying functions and the dynamics, and what are we actually doing with this? How are we using it? What does it matter? And so being able to translate it into all of those different kind of, manifestations or lenses of ways of saying the same thing in different words and symbols, basically. I think that's incredibly useful, and I think it's very instructive. Also, at the same time, there is that balance to strike of, well, how much service and how much violence are you doing to history? Are you maintaining the set of correspondences that kind of like the LBRP rolls up into so much other ritual and interconnects with so many other things that are more kind of the province of adept practical magic, that most people who are modifying the LBRP don't have that exposure to, that you don't necessarily know what levers you're tweaking. And yet, how much does it really matter? Like, for what purposes are they? And so I think it's an invitation in a lot of ways to step back from the form and from the specific content and to take a look at okay, why are we doing this? What are we trying to do? Now, that said, like with the LBRP as well, like no matter every single person that I have seen perform the LBRP does it differently. I have never heard anybody pronounce the Hebrew the same way. Like, even if the same person in the same temple trained them, everybody has like their own just little spin on it that makes it unique. And that's one of the things that's really cool to me about it, is you have this unified kind of consensus on, this is what we should be doing, this is like what the tradition prescribes, and this is why. And within that, you also have such boundless room for variation among so many dimensions that we don't even think about or consider, that seeing that and like being confronted with it, I think particularly if you're in a traditional temple, like being forced to listen to other people reciting Hebrew, particularly when you're a language nerd who has very strong ideas about the way things should be pronounced. It's it's like there are a lot of right ways to pronounce things. There are also a lot of wrong ways, but it really I think forces you to engage further with that question and to recognize that there's more potential and more kind of room for play and sandboxing and experimentation than I think a lot of us, when we're first getting into the tradition, or even well ensconced within it, kind of tend to lose sight of, because it is a tradition and we tend to be focused much more on the past and on reconstructing that tradition than we are on analyzing it conceptually and innovating based on first principle.
Awesome. All right. If you have any more questions, feel free to get back at the end of the line. Yeah, my neighbor's Wi-Fi. Go ahead.
Can't hear you.
All right, there we go. There we
Cool.
go.
Yeah.
Okay, so regarding the actual usage of magic, I'm noticing, at least what you've been saying so far, you have Greece, you have Egypt, and then you have the Order of the Golden Dawn. It seems like all of these institutions have now failed. They no longer exist, or at least exist in splinters of what they used to be. On top of that, within the orders, there's a lot of discord, jealousy, uh, forcing of the hierarchy. For example, Crowley, he was really targeted by other practitioners, as far as I understand. While the purpose of seeking out magic is, or using magic is to, I would, like, understood it correctly, was reach enlightenment, understand the higher self, and mostly just improve yourself spiritually. Why is it that these practitioners who had been in these institutions forever still were subject to these incredibly humanistic emotions, such as jealousy and wanting to keep others out? There
Yeah, it is a really challenging question, I think, to any student of the path. You know, I think anybody who is a student of the Golden Dawn or of Thelema has to confront the failings of their founders. More so in Crowley's case than in others, probably. You know, that's just me getting a dig in on Crowley. But no, I mean, as an example, you know, Isaac Newton's alchemical pursuits are much more well known these days. But you know, you hear about what Isaac Newton was like as a person. Like, you hear anecdotes about his life, and you're like, well, I mean, I know what he was looking for, but it's like, doesn't sound like he did a great job of finding it. And similarly, I think, sadly, the universe has a very deep and abiding sense of irony. And I think there are a lot of reasons why the magic, like this, the lodge-based ceremonial magic culture is particularly challenged structurally when it comes to its tendency to breed institutionalized toxicity. I think there are absolutely some, like, just in the organizations that I have been a part of, and seeing the challenges and shortcomings and the logistical hurdles that are kind of implicit within them. It's like, you know, the three chiefs model, I think especially the double-edged sword of secrecy and of opacity, like not having the transparency, not having open lines of communication. You know, there are a lot of issues come up. Even just like, okay, so, you know, I used to be a like departmental co-head for a local nerd con, like 7,000 people, and you know, when I started co-running the department, I started attending convention committee meetings. And then I saw just how much of a mountain people can make out of molehills when they have a lot of nerd rage, and things become very, very important to them. And so, like, the drama that particular conference generated is prodigious. And that kind of tends to be the case in, like, very strongly identified with subcultural affiliations. You know, whether it's nerd culture, whether it's queer culture, whether it's, you know, like alternative religion, anything, like things that matter a lot to people and that they super nerd out on, and that they have a very limited ability to pursue in their lives in, like, the ways that they are given contexts to do so. Like, it raises the stakes, and it really kind of turns up the pressure on pressure cooker. So I think there are a lot of, like, structural aspects that are just really unfortunate. And I think that to the extent that the tradition is going to be able to remain resilient and relevant, we're going to have to kind of figure out how we're going to adapt to that going forward, and to what extent we are willing to break with tradition and with the way that things have been done to develop more institutionally and organizationally healthy, kind of sustainable cultures going forward. Now, that said, I think that there are a wide variety of reasons why you see so much instability and toxicity and, you know, petty tyrants in spiritual leadership and in magic, unfortunately. Like, by and large, like, I will be the first to call myself out on this. Like, those of us who are most strongly drawn to magic and mysticism and the esoteric, not necessarily the most well-grounded people. not necessarily the people who are most in touch with reality, not necessarily the most well-adjusted people. And like this is a much more modern lens on things, but I think it's fairly safe to say that many of us who end up in this pursuit are neurodivergent of some flavor or another. So, especially not having had that frame of reference, for the last century or so, it really makes things a bit more complicated. But that said, like, by and large, you look at the history of religion in general, people screw it up. So the challenge is always kind of trying to find that which connects us to each other and to spirit and to the ground of our being, and yet how can we keep ourselves from fucking it up? It's an open question, and it's not one that I think we'll ever be able to solve. And it's one of those things that it's in the attempt, in the doing, in the struggle that we are defined.
Good answer. That's a really good answer. Holy shit. All right.
Awesome. Yeah, if you have more questions, feel free to get back in line. Sorry, here I'm gonna cut in here because we have a YouTube viewer who's been waiting for his question to be asked for quite some time now. So this is Matthias Layton's question. Was the Golden Dawn a secret branch of the Rosicrucian Order where some initiates were invited? Or was it an order that the three founders created apart from the Rosicrucian Order? Yeah, any thoughts, Nick?
The answer is yes. So there is not a direct institutional link between any previous Rosicrucian institution and the inner the Rosicrucian inner order of the Golden Dawn. The Rosicrucianism and the ethos and kind of foundational mythos of Rosicrucianism is the defining metaphor, I guess, of the second order in the Golden Dawn, in the same way that Greco-Egyptian is kind of the character of the outer order. Now that said, like that is via kind of inspirational transmission, like via affiliation and kind of that kindred spirit quality rather than any kind of direct lineage or influence. So in that respect, there is no direct tie to any kind of organized Rosicrucian body other than the SRIA, which itself was founded in 1801 as a paramasonic organization that itself didn't have a direct tie to that Rosicrucian. Now, the other part of that is kind of the invitation only thing. Second order has always been strictly invitation only. Like it has always been a, you can do the thing, but it is solely at the discretion of the chiefs as to whether you'll be invited into the second order. The reality of the situation at the founding of the Golden Dawn, and while it was in option originally, is that the secretive nature of the society itself meant that really, in practice, it was just invitation, because you weren't allowed to speak the name of it to people outside of you. You weren't able to provide enough information for people to be aware that it was a thing to be sought out. And so the only way that it really spread was by that kind of like, hey, I think this person would be it. I think we should chat him up. It's the same kind of way that it happens, I think, in Golden Dawn temples still, just in a much more kind of socially cohesive and geographically bounded context.
Thank you very much. And Matthias Layton, thanks for your question. Hiram.
I'm going to say anybody who has a question, go ahead and ask it, and then I'm going to kind of cut things off and bring it in for a landing here.
Yeah, sure. I think Hiram is the last one that's lined up for now. So I think that might be it. Cannot hear
Okay,
you. Oh, yeah, there you go. Here. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, great. Yeah, what do you think were the true origins of the cipher manuscripts, and what were the conditions? Yeah, what were the conditions surrounding the manuscripts coming into Westcott's possession? And would the Golden Dawn have been formed had he not received these documents?
That is such a fine set of questions, and it's a great set of questions in part because there is no solid answer to it. Like, there are a lot of really good theories, and there are some suggestive speculation, but by and large there isn't really a lot of evidence to suggest strongly any of those theories over many of the others. So that's kind of, one, we know a few of the, like, we know the immediate provenance of the cipher manuscript once it was discovered and passed to Westcott, etc. And we can speculate a bit as to kind of the earlier origins in, like, Penzi or what have you, but the ultimate provenance of that, like, you can kind of refer back to the Society of Eight and look at kind of other preceding organizations that had similarities of structure or similarities of grade titling and sequence, and you can see kind of, you can infer from that kind of genetic similarity, okay, well, perhaps this is where that came from. But really, it's one of those things that it's like there is enough ambiguity there in the documentary evidence that it is a mystery in the true sense, in that it is a question that you can explore endlessly and never really find the answer. And as to whether the Golden Dawn would have been founded if it hadn't been for the cipher manuscript, that's a wonderful question. And that to me is, I think, the kind of the central question really is, to what extent did that kind of catalyze this sort of inchoate, swirling, confluence of inspirations and ideas into a kind of synthesized, cohesive form. Like, there's a lot of that kind of implicit symbolic structure in the cipher manuscript that really isn't unpacked, and that I think is embellished a lot in what it got built out into in the Golden Dawn. But like, there's still an impressive wealth of symbolism and language being used in ways that are sufficiently sophisticated that they kind of belie the plainness of the outline format, right? And so, it does force you to wonder, like, okay, well, was in the chicken and egg problem of this, was this the thing that kind of lent the unifying thread of kind of initiatory ritual structure and form into this thing that was already looking for one? Or did this dropping in Westcott's lap kind of spark something? Did it catalyze something that wasn't there before? And, those are the kind of questions that we may never be able to answer, but there's some of my favorite ones to ask and to just kind of immerse myself in and wonder about.
That's great, thanks.
All right, wonderful. Yeah, I think that's it then. No more questions. Yeah, so I want to thank you very much, Nick, for all the time you took preparing, and the 3 hours we spent together was a great time. I hope you enjoyed it too. And yeah, let's
thoroughly. And I just want to, by way of wrap up, I just want to say thank you so much. Like, this has been an honor and a pleasure, and this is one of the things that I love most doing in life, is just nerding out and enthusing with other people who are enthusiastic about the same things I am. So thank you for this opportunity. It has been lovely talking with you today. I certainly hope to do so again in the near future, and thank you again for having me.
Yeah, very awesome. Yeah, thank you very much. So, yeah, let's give Nick some emojis, some applause, whatever works for you guys. Thank you again, Nick. And yeah, we'll have a chat about any future events. We'd love to have you back, obviously, and I'm sure I'm speaking for others here as well. Yeah, I
Love it,
did
certainly love
notice.
it too.
Oh, okay, yeah, awesome.
Yeah, that's an omission.
YouTube channel.
Yeah,
Could you maybe mention those? I'm gonna write them up on the screen as well, and post them in the stream
absolutely.
chat. Yeah, let's go.
Yeah, I fail at self-promotion. So, um, yes, by all means, like reach out to me. My website is hermeticulture.org. My YouTube username is hermeticulture1, or maybe that's my Twitter. I can never remember. One of them I couldn't get the one without a birds, but either way, you can also like hit me up on Discord or anywhere else. My username pretty much everywhere is McCryptoface, MCCRYPTO face. So say hi, drop me a line, shoot me a question. I am notoriously bad at responding to messages, and it takes me a while, but I will get back to you eventually. So I just tend to be chronically over.
Awesome.
But yes, by all means, like reach out, ask questions. I just like if you want to just nerd out about something or say, hey, that was really cool, like I am here for it. So
Yeah, wonderful. So write out the URL. Let's see. That is also, if you search Hermetic-culture, if you look above my head, just search it on YouTube and you'll instantly find Nick's channel. I've also well. Yeah, okay, let's wrap this up. Thanks again, Nick. It was a lovely time, and I'm sure we'll meet again here soon enough. Yeah, have a good day,
thank you so
everyone.
much.
Done there yet. Yeah, thanks for supporting not only these events but the development of our VR space, which for anybody watching on YouTube, you can download vrchat on the PC, start it up by yourself, enter the space, without anything going on here. You can explore the facilities. There's many interactive resources here to do with the Golden Dawn, but also many other traditions like Buddhism, yeah, and plenty other stuff. So if that's interesting to you, feel free to check it out. We also have events for the community, like the Saturday meeting where solitary practitioners come together, discuss their progress and their challenges. If that sounds like something you're into, feel free to join that as well. More information about all that stuff at the website vrmysteryschool. Yeah, for anybody watching on the stream, I'll post it in chat as well. For now, thanks for joining. Thanks for joining everybody here in VR. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time. Bye bye. And of course, for anybody that would like to, we'll have a little chit chat in the lounge. I'll be there. Maybe Nick won't make it because I'm sure he's tired. He mentioned he's on zero sleep, but we'll see.
I'm gonna take a nap.
Yeah, I figured. Okay. Well, see you next time, Nick. Thanks again. And see you next time, viewers on the stream and everybody in here in VR. Take care for now.